So welcome to another video from theplayersaid.com. My name's Alexander, and today we're doing another episode of From Cover to Cover, which is our kind of book review series that's appeared on the channel for about a year now. And today we're taking a look at a book called The 30 Years' War by C.V. Wedgwood. Now this is what I would call kind of like a classical piece of history, right? There's a few of those books over the years that have just been around a long time and for the longest time were like the authority on a given topic, and that everyone read, but partly because it was the only one at the time, right? So I think that there's things like The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is by Gibbons, 30 Years' War by Wedgwood, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, I think, is this is kind of like the World War II one. Guns of August for the kickoffs of World War One. You know, you get these ones that were kind of written in the 20th century. They were extremely popular, again, because it was histories that were written for the everyman, but that were also still very detailed and just have stuck around. And this is one of those. And I read this year almost on a whim, which I'm not typically want to do with something like this. So this particular edition is from the New York Review of Books, NYRB, and I read this because I've had it on the shelf for a long time, but Bill, friend of the show, he happened to be reading it, and he'd mentioned it in our patrons Slack channel. He was like, "Oh, I'm reading this," and I was like, "You know what? I happened to be like I had just finished a different book, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna do it. We're gonna do like a faux buddy read where we kind of read it together." And what happened is that this thing has 12 chapters. I think it's 500 odd pages. And for every chapter, he kind of posted his thoughts and of that particular chapter in a little thread. And then when I would read it, because I was reading a little bit behind, I would go in, post my comments, and we ended up having a discussion about it. And so in kind of our books channel, there's 12 different threads, each for one chapter of this book, and discussing back and forth different elements of that particular chapter, parts of the history. And so, all that to say, that was really wonderful. I had a great time, and appreciate Bill for inspiring me to have read this. So the 30 Years' War, what is it, if you don't know? Because, I'll be honest, I don't know if I knew much about it other than the name of it, and loosely that it ended with the Peace of Westphalia. So the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, and it is a very complex conflict with lots of different layers that started as part of with elements of the Counter-Reformation. So you have this religious layer where you have very strong Catholic Counter-Reformation forces going on versus kind of the German Protestant princes. But you also have a layer of the German electorates electing a new Habsburg emperor, but then you also have the Habsburg emperor and his tie to the Spanish king, who's a good Catholic, and the Spanish king was bankrolling the Habsburg Empire at that point, basically. And so you have, and then you have like all of the different electorates, the Palatines, you have geographical concerns, you also have the Spanish Netherlands against oh gosh, what was it called? Is it the United Provinces, I think? I don't know if it's Confederation, United Confederation of Provinces, something like that. The Protestant Dutch Netherlands, basically. You have that, then you have like, aside from this, you have, before Sweden kind of joins in halfway through, Sweden and Poland are fighting, or it's the Commonwealth of Polish Lithuania, or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, I think is what it's called, something crazy like that. So you have all this stuff's going on, tons of layers, everyone dies, you get new layers of guys, and there's like 2 people who like start and live through the whole thing. I think there's 3. And it's just wild, all the stuff that's going on. And so a book like this was really helpful because to garner all of that from some other various sources or from like a board game would be quite difficult, just because there's so many layers of things going on. So all that to say, you're talking about this is the era of musket and pike. So they've got, you know, rudimentary firearms, muskets. They've got small cannon, but you have still, you know, cavalry charging with lances. You have infantry with pikes, halberds, that type of thing, that are kind of the core and the bulk of things as well. So that's the type of warfare that we're engaging in. And there's so much interesting information in this book. But what I will say is I don't know what I was expecting. I was expecting there to be more military focus in this than there was. So just know that going into it. It's not a knock. It's just, I don't know what I was expecting, but that's what I was expecting. So I would say 85% of this book is about the politics. It's about the leaders, the lines of succession, the various maneuverings and negotiations. And if you read this, you'll understand why that's so complex. Because you're like, cool, the King of Bohemia, Frederick, Frederick the Second, maybe, I can't remember. A lot of the numbers are confusing. You know, him trying to become the Holy Roman Emperor in the face of is it Frederick or Friedrich? Against Ferdinand. Lots of F's, that's what it was. Because there's also someone called Friedrich, but that's later on. Yeah, Frederick of Bohemia, I'm pretty sure. Well, he was trying to, he like didn't really want to become the king, or didn't want to become the Holy Roman Emperor, but like, he's doing all this stuff, and it's like partly to protect the Protestant cause, partly to protect the German liberties and their kind of independence, but then like, it puts him in such a poor position against the emperor, and so it causes war, and like, is that really the cause, and all this other stuff that's going on. There's so much complexity with all the different layers of like, hey, if this guy does this, it has this knock-on effect, and that has this knock-on effect, and then this has a knock-on effect, and so everyone's got their fingers in every single pie, and that's why it's like 85% politicking, basically, just because that's so complex. And so the actual military campaigning, which there is a lot, right? It covers 30 years of military campaigns. A lot of it is just glossed over. Like, it's like, hey, this person marched here, and then here, and then here, and then here, and then there was one particular battle. There's probably like 4 battles in here that are like described in any amount of detail. And even then it's like a page or 2 of the actual battle, right? There's just not that much. Partly that's a historical detail thing, but partly because that's just not the focus of this book. So all that to say, just know that that's what your expectations are. I was thinking there was going to be a bit more, because I think the tactics and the strategies of the military campaigns of this particular period are so interesting, because it's quite different, and it's this kind of inter-period before it was, you know, when we get 100 years, not even 100 years later, 100 years later, for like Napoleonics, not Napoleonics, when you get into like things having been more fully moved to gunpowder, where this is like this weird half and half between like medieval style cavalry charges and pikes and things like that, with some muskets, to, you know, 100 years later, we'll say 100 years later, you're really like talking everything's gunpowder. And you really loot, like cavalry had sabers at that point, not lances, and they function differently. And then 100 years after that, you start getting into like really, into the 1800s. Swords were just a symbol at that point almost. They were very rarely used. That's not particularly not wholly true, but you get the idea. Like this is such an interesting section of the progression of warfare, but so little of that is really talked about. There's still a lot that is talked about that was interesting. I thought the most interesting stuff was when you're getting into how the opponents were treated, where it was like if you took someone's banner and they surrendered, more often than not, those soldiers who were professional soldiers half the time would just you captured them, they worked for you now. You had to pay them, but like they worked for you. So as you would defeat an army, you would take losses, but those would be substituted by all the guys who would then like sign up to your winning army, and you would just deplete, and then you'd fight them again with now more numbers than they had, and it's this net, taking away and you gaining, like that flip-flopping, and your allegiance was to your banner and whoever was paying you, rather than if you look at stuff today, and what has been for probably the past long while, that doesn't happen so much anymore. It's much rarer because the professional soldiery is much more tied to national identity or specific ideologies where and I think information security is also that much more important, where you're not just flipping sides and trusting these guys to like hang on with you, right? Some people might be pressed into service, but it's not the same as it was back then. I just think that was a really interesting, unique part of what warfare looked like back in the 1600s. I thought that was something that was really it comes up so often in this. It was such interesting to contend with how like that's so divergent, I think, from what we experience now. But I really enjoyed this book. I think I liked it, but I didn't love it. There are parts of it that's quite dry. It's quite slow. There's parts of it that's really interesting. There are parts where Wedgwood is extremely opinionated about things, and there's lots of sources cited, but like she'll just go on a ramble about how this particular person was mega incompetent and like didn't have the personality traits to be a leader, and they were a bit of a waffle, and there's like one source for it and just kind of moves on. You're like, okay, I guess I'll just trust you on that one. But there are parts of it that were very, very cool, very interesting, and there are parts of it that was like you had to get through as well. There are still important informationally speaking, but it's like we could have picked up the pace a little bit. Not a perfect book by any means, but I think an important one. And I think one of the other interesting parts of this book is that this was put out in 1938. So this was written in the interwar period, as we call it. But this is a book that covers so much, such an important part of the German-speaking people's history. And the conclusions at the end of this book are really interesting. And I really, really think it's worth it, if only for that last chapter. Is well worth it, talking about what happened, what was fought over, for how long, how the people suffered, and how, to what extremities, the depravity that was done to dispels a few myths about the numbers, which I think was interesting as well. I think there's a lot of myth around the 30 Years' War of like, oh, some places lost up to 3/4 of their, populations. Like it was devastating to the German nation, whatever that looked like at the time. And it took them, 100 years minimum to try to recover from this, even longer. And she's like, well, sure, but like some of those, it's not like, 3/4 were killed. A bunch of them were, but a bunch of them were displaced, and a bunch of them returned later. Like there was burgeoning refugee camps everywhere, because especially where places were devastated over and over and over again. You think about Bohemia, Saxony, Bavaria, where the armies were marching so often. Half the people were left, they were displaced, but it wasn't like everyone died. A lot of people did die, but not everyone. So just that was interesting, but it basically boils down to like so much suffering was done for what, and so little was actually changed for the day to day for many people, um, and the Germans got nothing out of this basically, and it ended up being a national war between like between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, basically. These two families fighting each other on German soil is what it ended up being for like the last few years. Before it hadn't been that, but very quickly, well, not very quickly, but it became that, and it was, and you know, I think the conclusions and the things that she talks about at the end of this book are very interesting within the meta of when this was written in 1938, a year before the Germans kick it all off again. And I don't know, because 1938, you've already had the all the crises. 1936, Hitler comes to power, and you already have things like Anschluss going on, and you have a lot of these other crises that are being appeased by the other European powers to try to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And she publishes this in 38, and it's like, at what point did she think that this kind of thing, that the kickoff of a new European war was inevitable, or did she think it was still avoidable? Because some of the ways that she's talking about things have an inevitability to them. Like, we've ignored things that have happened and they're going to happen again. And a year later they do. And I just think that that is such a fascinating part of this book, that this book is not about at all, really. But you get a few hints of that, of the modernity of when she's writing it, are in there. And you can't help but read some of the futility of the back and forth, nothing happens, and everyone suffered. And what have we got, right? It's the same stuff, based on appalling ideology and the hubris of a few people in power. Appalling things that were done in the 20th century. And yeah, that cause was defeated, and that's wonderful. But it's like, we never had to go there in the first place. And so much suffering was done, and at what cost? And for what reason? And defeating fascism is always the reason, but like, the fascism didn't have to be there in the first place. It didn't have to be there in the first place. But I thought this book was so interesting, based on the context of when it was written and what it was writing about and who it was writing it about, and about how you transition from things like local lords and religious ideologies to national identity as something that starts to form, and people rally around national identities, whereas before there wasn't really a German national identity at all in the way that we would consider it now, right? Germany didn't exist. It's not a unified state. At the end of this book, with the Peace of Westphalia, you see the nascence of like a Prussian state that gets built, which then becomes or turns into a German state eventually, a long time later. But you get so much of this stuff starting, and it's just a fascinating book in its own right, but it's not the easiest read, it's not the cutest read. It was written in the 30s, it's a little dry at times, but it's still important. This is a great foundation for other things that you might want to read on top of it. So I will be taking this and like, hey, I might want to read a biography on Ferdinand II. I might want to read a book on Ferdinand III and Leopold and their relationship as brothers within the context of ascension of power within the Habsburg family, because I think that's interesting. I'd like to read about, I think it was Charles XIII. I'd like to read more about him, because, and Richelieu, I think is his cardinal's name. Fascinating character. I'd like to read more about the Swedish king Gustav Adolphus, because I think he was fascinating, and was able to have done so much, and the way that he was viewed. And Wedgwood, it's one of the few people she actually likes, which was interesting. So much stuff that's going on, But this is a great foundation on which to build. I think that's a really great purpose that it serves, as well as it being a long-standing piece of kind of classical history that so many people have read over the years. So let's talk about a few war games, and this is the really interesting part. I was like, oh, I've got this and this and this on the shelf, and it turns out I don't have anything, which I think is pretty funny. I just don't have anything with me. So I'm going to talk about a few different things, but this is mostly a video of games that I would like to get into and would like to go and play or try, and I'd like your opinions on. Because I can't recommend a ton, because we haven't played a ton on this. But I was like, oh, it gives me an excuse to go and play this and this. And I looked at my shelves and I was like, oh, I thought I had some. So, first off, there is a game, so GMT Games has a big kind of point-to-point game called The 30 Years' War. It's from like back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I haven't played it, and I think I would like to. I think it's a CDG, think the Napoleonic Wars, Here I Stand. Not quite the same as those, but it's that kind of a game, I believe. So there is one that covers kind of a lot of it, and there's some, it was interesting talking to Bill. He's played it, and he played it before having read the book, and so he was like, we were reading about, oh gosh, what was his name? The Catholic military leader, and I should know what his name is, and I don't remember off the top of my head, and Wallenstein. I think it was Wallenstein. You have the option in that game, there is a card where, like, you fire him as your leader, because he gets too powerful. Or was it Maximilian? I can't remember. I should know that, and I don't remember. There's a lot of names in this book. But there's a card to like bring him back in and then to assassinate him. Because he was gaining too much power because power came from your military might. That's really, by the end of this book, by the end of the 30 Years' War, power only existed at the hand of your troops. And he was too powerful for the Habsburg Empire to control because he controlled their armies, effectively. I'm pretty sure it was Wallenstein. And all that to say, like, we were reading it and he was like, oh, that's why that card exists. And we're reading about why that card in that game exists. And that was really a cool point. So I'd like to play that at some point because I think it would be interesting, and who knows. It might show its age a little bit, but I think it would be interesting to play that game, having done this and knowing a bit more about it. But a game that we have played is a game from Hollandspiel. And I don't know if you can even get this anymore. We played it a number of years ago at WBC. And they have a game called Westphalia. And you literally play out the 30 Years' War in a very high level, very abstract way, and you're doing all of that so that, at the end of it, at the Peace of Westphalia, everything is ruled in your favor. And it is a 6-player game, and it is only a 6-player game. And I think you have, like, you have Austria, you have Saxony, and I think Bavaria, and then you have Sweden, the Netherlands, and someone else. I can't remember. But you basically have, it's kind of like a 3v3, although it's not. Everyone's out for themselves. But like the Austrians win only if they can get their subordinates to win as well. And they have to get them both to their specific victory conditions. Otherwise, it's impossible for them to win because they need to satisfy their underlings, basically. And so you might work with one to satisfy one, and you're like working with these guys, but these guys then leave you out in a lurch because they've got what they wanted, and they don't help you, and all the time you're fighting these guys. Anyway, all that to say, at the time, it was like, oh, this was cool. It was a little abstract. I didn't really understand some of it because I didn't understand the history of it. And now I'm like, oh, I would love to go back and play that again. And just have, because I have a much better understanding of it and what was being fought over and why, I think it would be that it ascended to an even greater level because it was very cool, but you can't play it at less than 6 players. It's 6-player only. And now I'm like, oh man, I really want to go back and play it again because it was really good, but now I'm like, oh, it would be, I would enjoy it that much more, is what I'm saying. I don't even know if you can get that game anymore. I hope you can. There are a few other games. I wanted to play some battle games, because some of the battles in this are really interesting. Nördlingen, Breitenfeld, those are kind of the two big ones. But I think the battle on the White Hill was really interesting. That first real, well, it was a crushing defeat for the Protestants, and really the Protestant cause from that, from like a religious standpoint, never recovered in that instance. It became quite national very quickly after that. But that was a really interesting battle to read about as well, and how that all went down. So I looked for some games, and I'm like, oh, I had the Musket and Pike Duel Pack on my shelf from GMT Games. That's from Ben Hull, and it had been on the shelf for a while. It just hadn't, and so we actually, I don't have it anymore. We did a kind of a giveaway, and I gave it away as a prize because it was still in its shrink. So now I need to go track down another copy of that, because that had a couple battles in it from the 30 Years' War, and I'm like, dang it, I gotta play that. I don't want it back, that was a gift. That's not what I'm talking about. But that was one where I was like, oh, I had it, and now I'm like, oh, I don't have it. I thought that I had The Lion of the North from the Great Battles of History series, and so I looked on my shelves, I was like, oh, get it off the shelf. It's literally the only one I don't have. And I had read that because the way that the musketry works in it, Lion of the North really doesn't fit in or work particularly. It doesn't work as well in that system as the other games do. And so that, I think that's why I hadn't purchased it in the end, even though I had a few opportunities to. But I'm still like, I don't care. I would still give it a go. I'd still give it a go and play it. And I literally thought that I had bought it at some point, because I have a lot of the other ones. And I went to reach on my shelves, like, I literally just don't have it, which is frustrating. Decision Games has a Breitenfeld game, one of their little Polybag Folio style games. And I almost got that, but I haven't picked it up yet. So there's a few games out there that cover some of the battles, because I would like to do that. There's a big, the big GMT 30 Years War game probably would be interesting. I'd like to get a go at that, but Westphalia was really good, but you must have 6 and only 6 players, so that's kind of hard for people to get to. So if you have games on the 30 Years War or about or around that, I would like to know, or if you have opinions on any of the ones that we've talked about, I'd like to hear about those. But mostly I'm looking for recommendations of, I think I'd like to play a big one with everyone, like a multiplayer game, to see what that looks like. If you like that game, let me know, or if there's some other one I just don't know about, I'd be interested to hear that, because this was interesting. A lot of factions, a lot of stuff going on, but also, like, Sweden were a fighting force in this game, like a really strong, powerful one, for like 3 to 5 years. And after that, they stopped doing anything, right? France doesn't do anything in this until the very end, right? Everything else is politicking, so I just don't know how well a 30 Years War multiplayer game works and is interesting, where it's like, this person didn't do anything for 25 years, and for 5 years they do something. Or this person does something for all 30 years, and then this person does something for the first 5 years, and then doesn't do anything for 15 years, and then does a little bit at the end. Like, is that interesting? Is that good? I don't know, because I've not done one in the same way that other games where it's like everyone's doing something all the time. It keeps the players engaged, it's better game design. Or do you just lose the intricacies of what actually happened, and you just have this kind of multiplayer factional game, which could be fun, that would be interesting as well, but how divergent is that from what actually happened? Who knows? All that to say, I enjoyed reading this. I would recommend it to people if they have an interest in this period. I think a lot of you probably have read this, and I would like to hear your opinions on this particular book. And if you have other if this inspired you, you've read kind of other different, more specific books based on having read this, I would also be interested in hearing about that as well. But I had a good time with this. This was on my shelf of shame of reading. I've literally owned this book for a few years now. And I'm glad that I got to it, and I'm glad Bill inspired me, and I'm glad we got to discuss it so rigorously online. And I look forward to more of that kind of discussion in our books Slack channel. It was good fun. And I appreciate you all very much for tuning in. I've been Alexander from theplayersaid.com.